Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice Program, How Things Work, the Legal Edition, which is a rapid response project that addresses how our civil rights are being impacted by actions being taken by the new administration. My name is Stephanie Duke. I am currently the supervising attorney at Disability Rights Texas, doing all things disaster related. And I am thrilled to welcome you to this conversation with my colleague Kate, who will introduce herself in just a second. These videos are a unique opportunity to address what is happening in America today, clarify any misinformation or disinformation being spread, and how civil rights and social justice advocates can act to protect the rights of everyone. So today we're here to talk about disasters and all things that related to that. Kate, if you want to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Steph. I am Kate Thorstad. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a white woman with very curly blonde hair and blue eyes. And today I'm wearing a blue and white striped shirt and black blazer. I'm a civil rights litigator based in New Orleans, Louisiana, and the attorney leading up the disaster and environmental justice work at Disability Law United. I came to Disability Law United about 3 years ago on the heels of an Equal Justice Work Disaster Resilience Fellowship at Disability Rights Louisiana, where I assisted survivors of Hurricanes Ida and Laura, and where I got interested in more systemic advocacy around accessible emergency preparedness and response, which is how Steph and I met. So, Steph, I'll turn it over to you for a brief intro.
Yes, again, Stephanie Duke here, attorney at Disability Rights Texas, doing all things disaster related. I'm a middle-aged Caucasian woman, tall, slender. I have short, gray salt and pepper hair right now. Reporting to you from my Houston home office. And currently, we are in the brace of getting an event that comes through, winter weather event. So, yes, doing all things disaster related, but we're here specifically to talk about impacts on people with disabilities in events, after events, and before events, and what that looks like as far as barriers and social justice issues and providing meaningful access. So let's talk about specifically, we're going to broad overview, and we have a short amount of time, so this is just topical, but at the end of the day, the government is initially responsible, right, for people's safety and welfare. Each state has a disaster act that is codified to do those types of things. So local jurisdictions and state agencies are responsible for protecting people and property when events happen. Um, we do have federal resources like FEMA and other programs that come in, but at the end of the day, disasters start and end locally. So each jurisdiction, right, has that responsibility to coordinate assets and resources, and it's like herding cats. It's this whole, plan, right? Emergency operation plans that happens at the local level, right? And then if things are needed beyond that because you've got unmet needs or you don't have the capacity, then it goes up the chain of command to your regional, to your state, and then federal supports as well. But so each state has a duty to plan for disasters. Disasters are not just natural events, they're also man-made events, chemical explosions, train derailments, cybersecurity issues, ransomware attacks, which happens all the time, special events, your sporting events, all, mass gathering type things, and then also public health emergencies. So it's not just natural. And all of these plans have to identify those risks and prepare the communities for that impact because it's not going to be a normal situation, right? You're going to have disruptions, the lights are going to go out, power is going to be out, road closures, all the things. And those plans have to plan for the whole community, right? And unfortunately, people with disabilities and the impact of these events looks different um, on their supports, services, and meaningful access. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So, again, at the end of the day, what the government provides, emergency support functions, is one thing, right? And then it all talks about, it all starts with those plans at those jurisdictional levels when something happens, what response and recovery is going to look like. But then we also have additional programs, federal programs that come in when we have a federal declaration, right, that the president signs off on. All that, that's a signal about authority and, emergency powers that these different programs can come in. FEMA, Small Business Administration, USDA, HUD, long-term recovery. So I'll let Kate kind of talk about that for a second.
Yeah, so we're in a moment where there is much talk and some action of the fiscal responsibility for emergency preparedness and response being returned to the states. So we are in a moment of a little bit of shakeup, but pre-event, generally, you frequently get for, let's say, big storms that are forecast, perhaps, you might get emergency declarations in that local jurisdiction or state that free up state and federal funding for the local jurisdiction's government to prepare for, let's say, that storm to hit, if this is a foreseeable event, and then immediately respond as it's happening. But historically, most individuals really want to know, when does FEMA get here? Where is FEMA? Um, that answer is individual households are only going to be really interacting with FEMA programs after an event. So FEMA programs become available to individual households after the state's governor makes a request for a FEMA declaration, a generally major disaster declaration, pending a damages estimate that has to reach a certain valuation, which is then approved by the president. So the governor can request an emergency declaration or a major disaster declaration. The latter is what allows for those individual household programs and assistance. And this process of getting a declaration and assistance becoming available has become much bumpier, more politicized, and drawn out recently. Steph is laughing. So most individuals and households, like I said, they end up interacting with FEMA in the weeks and months after disasters, and often later state-based programs that are administered by the state, but which receive federal funding. So FEMA grants to households are mostly focused on real property, on rendering a house habitable or assisting someone with funding a place to stay in the meantime and to providing reimbursement or funding for immediate life-sustaining needs. But a key source of funding for local governments are these community development block grants. This funding historically has come from HUD or the Department of Housing and Urban Development and focuses on infrastructure, economic development, public facilities, housing rehabilitation, but also public services in the months and years after a disaster. So that's a big pot of money that individuals might not be aware of, but that really impacts response and recovery. Um, on maybe backtracking a little bit to home repair assistance under FEMA, it is a long time issue that there's a singular definition of habitability, even though what makes a home habitable, say, to me, and I do not use a wheelchair, is not going to be the same as what makes a home habitable to someone who relies on a wheelchair. So FEMA tried to address some issues like this in recent years by saying they will pay for a few select accessibility improvements like ramps and grab bars. But this underlying issue of a single habitability standard remains with some accompanying pickles. Steph, I know you also mentioned the SBA, I think, and USDA. Do you want to speak to those at all?
Just to say that there are lots of resources that become available in a major disaster declaration, the federal disaster declarations. Some are grants, some are loans, and that should also be part of what the local jurisdiction is doing in preparing and planning their community, education and outreach. Like, what are all of those resources? But specifically for people with disabilities, it has to look at their needs too, right? And it has to be inclusive. One of the things that we did see from FEMA under the previous administration was a lot of whole community approaches, right? Recognizing vulnerable, marginalized populations and putting out guidance and training on how to do that at the local level. Unfortunately, with this current administration, like Kate said, we're in a bumpy road. There's a lot of uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen. So people need to be prepared, and that's part of it. And it's not just about, yes, everybody is going to need, financial assistance to help with an insurance. That's a whole other session, right? But there are ways to be better prepared in the communities and things that we need to look at. So,
And then I'm going to circle back to something you mentioned earlier up, Steph, risk analysis and hazard mitigation. So to kind of situate that, emergency operations plans at the local and state levels, they are really based on their hazard mitigation plans and the risk analysis that has to come before that. So it's kind of a chain. Again, the terrain is shifting under us as federal funding shifts. So in the past, cities and counties were, and states, I guess, incentivized to produce these risk analyses and hazard mitigation plans in order to unlock hazard mitigation funding from the federal government. These hazard mitigation plans, per the name, they're plans for actions taken up front to prevent or mitigate morbidity, mortality, property damage in the event of an identified set of likely events specific to that jurisdiction. So in New Orleans, that should include hurricanes, it should include saltwater intrusion, among others. Some jurisdictions are going to need to prioritize freeze events or tornadoes. The present and future of these hazard mitigation funds is uncertain, so it's possible that local jurisdictions will be doing less risk analysis and hazard mitigation, even though more is direly needed. Now, federal disability law requires that the disability community be specifically accounted for in these hazard mitigation plans, but in practice, you don't really see that all that much. Part of the difficulty for those tasked with risk analysis and hazard mitigation is a lack of data. We live in a somewhat feudal system when it comes to funding, hosting, sharing of data for public health or other purposes. So it's essential that Medicaid, Medicare, departments of health, public health researchers and practitioners be engaged by the planners and emergency management departments to help shine a light on the population's needs with demographic data and in order to include the actual local disability community in compliance with federal law, which I think brings us more to planning and preparedness. Back to you, Steph.
yes. So, one of the things about planning is you got to have the right people at the table, right? I am not an individual with a disability, but I'm an advocate because I've helped hundreds, if not over 1,000 clients now in disasters with the same thing, right? They're the same issues. They don't have access to emergency support functions or federal programs because applications aren't accessible or programs and policies weed out people with disabilities for whatever reason. That planning, right? To provide equity, you have to have intent. And that planning process, that is where you find the intent and have the right people at the table saying, "Oh no, no, we need to think about this," right? If we're going to have emergency sheltering operations, do we have programmatic supports as well? Procuring, right? And all those things that you have to do administratively to have those assets in play when response comes because it's unrealistic to think we're going to do it after an event. If you haven't thought about it beforehand, the reality is it's not going to happen. So, um, you've got to, the reasonable accommodation in all of this is the inclusive planning process. That's where the money is. That's where we make changes. That's how we provide equitable and meaningful access to response and recovery services from any program or entity after an event.
And I want to jump in and note we keep throwing around emergency support functions. These are things like evacuation, shelter, distribution of food and water, public information. And as Steph was saying, a plan that involves a lot of ad hoc responses to fill in blanks and actualize a disaster response, it's not going to provide meaningful access to people with disabilities. That standard I'll discuss in just a second, but It's important to note that people with disabilities are often the very people who are most likely to need and seek out emergency programs and services for a number of socioeconomic reasons across the board. But inclusive planning with and for the disability community is a rare exception. And that baseline is unacceptable, if emergency managers' mandate is to decrease morbidity and mortality, in addition to it being a problem legally. So maybe getting at that meaningful access standard we've also thrown out. Meaningful access is the core bar to meet under disability law when it comes to programs and services. There's a lot of case law interpreting the phrase under our two granddaddy federal disability laws, Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504. It's one and the same. The denial of meaningful access to programs and services violates the law, and it's generally addressed as a holistic consideration of the impact of how a certain policy is written or administered on the disability community. So, how many people are partly or fully excluded, and to what end, to what result? Alexander v. Choate is the seminal meaningful access case, but a lot of cases go beyond the bar in that case and requiring modifications to programs and services. On the other hand, courts will sometimes effectively bless the denial of services where that access to services is unequal but still found to be meaningful. Um, Steph, I think maybe over to you.
Um, you know, especially in disaster too, when we talk about meaningful access broadly, right? A lot of people think just about architectural, right? Having the ramp, having the curb cut, elevators, what for people in wheelchairs, right? But it's also the programmatic pieces. And when we talk about emergency support functions and disaster programs, again, it's ensuring that they have meaningful access throughout the whole thing. Application, process, supports, whatever it is. And that all has to be planned for as well. Again, with what government is providing as far as operations, right? Emergency support functions, there's a planning process for that that includes the risk mitigation and gap analysis and all those things. But also with your other federal, state, local programs, even, nonprofit community-based organizations, it's recognizing that you have to consider and address what meaningful access is in your program development and planning and also implementation and rolling that out. It's not just a checky box here and there. You've got to bring the right people again to the table to have those discussions to make sure we're doing what we should be doing to get those equitable outcomes at the end of the day. So, I'm not sure. Oh, 2 minutes left. So not much time, but disasters are not going away. All types like events we know we're going to have natural events are increasing with severity and frequency year to year. Cybersecurity is another huge issue we're going to have to deal with technological advances, which is great, right? But it's all the things that we don't think about, the unintended consequences and all that kind of stuff. So at the end of the day, as far as ensuring access, equitable access, right? Again, it's having those conversations, getting your advocates at the table, educating your consumers and beneficiaries too, right? Your clients, how they can empower themselves, be involved in public comments, go to your town hall meetings. If you have an event that happens and you get this federal money coming in, there are going to be opportunities for you to participate. So empower yourself so we can increase that, autonomy and independence day to day. Kate, back to you.
I don't think I can top that for a send off in the last 30 seconds, but it was good to talk with you, Steph. Thank y'all.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having us.